I am Cuba. Sometimes it seems to me the sap of my palm trees are full of blood. Sometimes it seems to me that the murmuring sounds around us are not the ocean, but choked back tears of the people. Who answers to this blood? Who is responsible for these tears? In the early 1960s, Mikhail Kalatazov, an accomplished Soviet filmmaker, winner of the Palme d'Or for his wartime epic The Cranes Are Flying, was invited by the Cuban Institute of Cinematographic Art and Industry to produce a film about the Cuban Revolution. Soy Cuba, or I Am Cuba, appears to meet its agitprop brief, depicting the resilience and dignity of the Cuban people and the cruelty and clumsiness of the United States-backed military dictatorship. But Kalatazov and his visionary cinematographer Sergei Urosevsky went beyond the call of duty stylistically, using ultra-wide infrared lenses and elaborate long crane shots to bring viewers into the heat of the moment, whether it be a smoky bordello or a crop field ablaze. Kalatazov was given generous resources in production, but the finished film had very little exposure. Deemed too morally complex for the Reds and too red for the West. Only weirdos and cinephiles like Martin Scorsese and Francis Ford Coppola recognized the genius of I Am Cuba, and only after the fall of the Iron Curtain did it meet the audience it truly deserved. You're listening to MoobTube, the podcast that lost every battle but won the war. Owen, were you swept away by this sweeping epic?
I was. It's incredibly frustrating to me how long I put off watching this film.
Me too.
You know, it's one of those. Me too. It's one of those things that's kind of been floating around my periphery for a really long time. I knew its reputation ahead of it, I think. I knew that this was supposed to be a kind of difficult love child, and in some ways like even though it wasn't his second film, it was his penultimate film, but kind of like a difficult second album for Kalatazov, because The Cranes Are Flying, which was won him the Palme d'Or and also People's Artist of the Soviet Union, you know, much more reputable award in my view. He you know, it just is. I mean, you get a badge, which is quite cool. So it was the film he made after that. It was his penultimate film. He would make this, and like you said, there was like a fall from grace with this film in a way. It wasn't well received. I think in part it kind of tarnished his legacy a little bit. From the heights of The Cranes Are Flying, which is just like a barnstormer of a film. I think we can all agree it's just
The Cranes Are Flying is great. If listeners have seen I Am Cuba but not The Cranes Are Flying, that is also a very good film. I don't think it's quite as notable and remarkable, but it does have the same stylistic panache. It has amazing cinematography.
Which is Urosevsky, because he worked with Urosevsky on a lot of his productions. And you know, it's a really good partnership between them. And the film itself was a partnership as well, because it was, you know, this partnership between the Cuban Ministry of Culture, effectively, and Mosfilm, like the state production agency in the Soviet Union. And it's kind of weird how this was really a diplomatic exercise. It was like a military exercise. They filmed this during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is the most remarkable thing about it, that during this moment of like, fuck, the world is potentially going to end, and it's Cuba's like the defining moment in Cuban history and like the defining moment in the Cold War. They're like, oh yeah, we've got these Russians over, and they're not spies, they're not military advisors, they're just gonna film a kind of lyrical, hypnotic essay to the Cuban Revolution. It's like the timing couldn't have been better, it couldn't have been worse, maybe. Apparently, like Stephen Gott, like he wrote a really good history of like modern Cuba, was in Havana when the Russians were there, and he was there during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he's like, he remembers being in one of the hotels in Havana and just saying it was full of Russians. But it was all like film crew. It wasn't like teeming with Russians. It was like, but not like military advisors or anything. It was literally just like film crew. It was like this huge, like really massive crew with all this, like you said, all this insane equipment, like infrared cameras, these cool lenses, like underwater cameras, all this like strange equipment.
I'm really glad the Soviet Union existed. I'm not. I don't wish to endorse it's the many.
But what about Stalin?
The many deaths that occurred under Soviet Union rule and authoritarianism. I think every kind of, I think neoliberal capitalism has its own fatalities to answer for. But I guess the level of like resources that went towards both in architecture, although that's not my area of expertise, although you can speak very well about that, but in terms of film and art, like the amount of resources that went towards things that were not like conventionally popular, things that
and
were
not
like,
necessary,
exactly. I think the logic of capitalism, even when you look at the way that the Arts Council in England functions, the logic of capitalism really narrows down the kind of imagination you can have. With
everything
things.
has to be small scale. Like it just has to be breadcrumbs, right?
And of course, I Am Cuba was not like approved by the people that funded it, and so it did. And in many ways, for Kalatazov, it's very unfortunate because he didn't live to see it reach its. It's a Van Gogh syndrome there, really, but still, I'm very glad it got
rightly
made.
celebrated. Yeah, he was rightly celebrated during his career, but I mean, he didn't get to see the renaissance of this film. But you're right though, because the Soviet Union. I mean, when I say it's not necessary, I mean, for the Soviet Union, art and culture was his propagandistic tool. It was necessary, but it also goes back, right back to LEF in post-war. One of the first things Russia did after the 1917 revolution was like to create LEF, like a left culture organization, to create two competing cultural kind of quangos or things that would eventually become the Ministry of Culture, which kind of had a really fascinating period of a really interesting period of infighting between these two different groups, which kind of defined what would happen in the cultural conversation in Russia for like the next 50, 60 years. But between like one more bourgeois institution and one which was kind of a hangover from the imperial period, and one which was like Maxim Gorky style, like proper proletarian art, which is prolet cult. If you kind of an aside, but if you want to explore that, check out the kind of infighting between Lef and prolet cult, because it is really interesting.
Wow. That's for the heads.
That's for the real Soviet heads. But you're right, because they centered film and they centered the arts and said, when we do it, we're going to do it on a huge scale. I think of like Sergei Bondarchuk's War and Peace adaptation, which used I think I'm right in saying this, it had 100,000 extras, all of whom were Red Army conscripts, because he wanted to recreate the Battle of Borodino. And this was all and he's like, you
love this shit, don't you, Owen?
I love this shit, honestly. This is my jam, because he's like, we're gonna recreate the Battle of Borodino, but in order to do it, I want 100,000 soldiers on the field.
But back to Cuba.
Back to Cuba. But it has the same energy about it. Like, it's grand in scale and scope. It was like a diplomatic project in a way, wasn't it? It was like, because they were new allies, and Russia really didn't have many allies. So this was like a kind of tentative outreach, and also served ends because obviously Cuba was like bang next door to America, which is what precipitated the Cuban Missile Crisis, obviously. But the film, to talk about the film, I mean, it's hard to separate the film from its politics, but it is
shall I introduce the four stories?
It's an episodic film. The four elements aren't linked in any meaningful way. Apart from the serving the revolution.
Well, of course, but between each story, there's a voiceover, much like the one you heard at the start of the show, and they have a, where this female voice declares, "I am Cuba, Soy Cuba," and kind of reflects upon the historical position. I guess you can watch this film in those four parts if you want, although it gains momentum as each one builds. It starts with the story of a woman who is kind of forcibly seduced by some rather gauche American visitors.
She's a hooker, isn't she?
Yeah, she's a prostitute.
Yeah.
And these Americans, they don't speak Spanish, and so they communicate with her in a very patronizing way. This section kind of depicts the cosmopolitan life and culture and energy of Havana, but also
in
the
50s.
toxic presence of the Americans. The second story is about a farmer called Pedro, who is notified by the government that he doesn't own the land that he tends to, and that therefore he will be made redundant, and the land will be taken over by the United Fruit Company, I think it's called.
A real company, interestingly enough. A very real company.
So he sets fire to his farm. That's a pretty quick one, actually. There's an amazing third story about a student who is Enrique, who finds out through the news that Castro has been killed in Oriente province. This is #fake news. Castro wasn't killed in this particular province. It's propaganda from the US-backed military dictatorship, which he attempts to take down by taking down one of the generals. And he's on it's an amazing scene where he's on the roof of a modern office block, and he's aiming a gun very precisely through the viewfinder at this rather rotund individual.
The police chief, he is, I think.
Police chief, who's a representative of
Batista's government, I think. Yeah,
Batista government, indeed.
Yeah.
And but of course, being dignified and compassionate, as he gazes through the viewfinder and sees this police chief surrounded by a beautiful wife and child, he does not have it in his heart to pull the trigger. Which he's berated. This moment of lenience is caused him to be berated by his comrades. And in the fourth story, there's all-out bombing of a village, which leads to a man to join the Revolutionary Army, for which you have to find your own rifle by seizing it off an opponent, which is amazing.
By killing them and seizing it. It's a really interesting seizing of power, isn't it?
Well, where'd you get your rifle? All our rifles were gotten through fucking someone up gunless. Going in, fucking someone up gunless, ching them up, and then take their rifle.
Knife.
That just shows you the level of David and Goliath power that has led to the great communist republic that saw an incredibly low COVID death count in 2020.
Very low. We should be playing like the Cuban
very
national
low,
anthem
very low, wonderfully low.
We had the greatest, the best. No, I'm not going to do
It's over now, isn't it? He's the loser.
It's over now. It's all over now. Anyway,
Indeed.
So this film, you're right. It's an episodic structure, but they do have a momentum that flows into each other. Each of the stories kind of centers a figure who experiences a moment of brutality of some kind and has a moment of kind of realization or an epiphany of sorts. It's not
revolutionary fervor.
Revolutionary fervor takes you further. You know, it's not like. I'm
takes
really
you
tired.
Further. Wow,
takes you further.
Take the mic, MC Vince.
I'm firing on half a piston here. So each story has an epiphany. And interestingly, I think one of the reasons why this film was received quite coolly, well, the Cubans say that the film kind of peddles certain stereotypes about Cuba. I don't think it's the film they expected. I think they expected the film to be all part 4. Like this revolutionary militarist struggle against. I think they wanted it to be that, and it wasn't. It's a much more nuanced film where characters are seen in a very human light. Like you said, the police chief is seen to have a loving wife and family. There's a lot of Enrique's kind of student colleagues in the movement. There's a lot, them saying, don't blame the man. It's not the man. We're fighting the system. I'm sure the kind of the Cuban kind of financiers of the film would have preferred the police chief just to be an ogre. A kind of and Kalatazov made him a much more human, sympathetic figure, and that's what the Soviets, Mosfilm, kind of came back and said, wait, you've made the bourgeoisie look human in this film. That's why they were supposedly not particularly delighted with the results, but for that it's more affecting, and it's lasted.
I mean, this is the paradox with every propaganda longer, I mean, the clearest example is Tarkovsky, who had to basically trick the government every time into giving him money, and he did it very well, considering like his comrade Parajanov, who like got put in the gulag twice. There were obviously, it's like with the Arts Council, some people are just better at bullshitting these institutions than others. But yeah, I was pretty amazed that they took the position they did, given that this does to me feel like a fairly straightforward piece of propaganda. I think it's these criticisms they had of it seem kind of quite nuanced, really. And also, people who believe in propaganda are shit at storytelling. Like, really, like the idea of complexity, like the idea of painting someone as an ogre as being like an artistic aim is just fucking absurd. I don't know how you have to be fucking brain dead to ask someone to make that kind of film.
Oh no, exactly. But this is a different era, right? And it's almost like they're expecting a film of a different era and a different time and a different modality. Like, he's making this in the 60s during a new wave, kind of European upheavals, like fresh revolution, right? Leading up to 68. And Kalatazov is not blind to that. The film, has its parallels, and it kind of has a lot of similarities to Dovzhenko's Earth, but how it looks, the dramatics of it, the kind of rural nature of it. But the thing is, Earth was shot in 1930. This is like 34 years later. Things have changed. We've gone through the Khrushchev thaw. A lot of kind of artists in the Soviet Union who were formerly panned have kind of come in from the cold. Like, it's a different era, so the expectations of how they were going to make the film couldn't pan out because it's just a different time. And it's like what Kalatazov did is actually make a film for the ages. Maybe he knew that.
Must have done.
And I think it's more human, like people's motivations for joining. It's not like the propagandist inside you says that it will be obvious to the final character, for example, that he has to join the armed struggle, but he actually resists it because it doesn't. He's like, these hands are not for killing, they're for planting. And it's not until his son is killed that he joins the struggle. He's like, so there's not an obvious lure. People aren't, they have to find their own way to the revolution. And it's kind of what the film says a bit. The Betty, who's the character at the beginning, the prostitute, she doesn't even fight this world in a way. She's a victim of Batista's government in a kind of more passive way, perhaps. Because she's at the mercy of these, for her survival, at the mercy of these like disgusting American stereotypes. Can we talk about them? Actually, they all look like Andy Warhol, or like two of them, like these bright blonde wigs, and they're just like, "Hey, honey, hey, what do you know how to say?" And he kind of draws this awful portrait of her, doesn't he? Like, it's mad. God, that like, he's like sketching her, and it's just like.
I mean, they're all bastards, and then one of them is depicted as being like slightly less of a bastard, and then he turns out to also be a complete bastard.
He steals a crucifix, doesn't he?
He steals Betty. Yeah, when he pays money for it, but he has no understanding of sentiment or like he thinks he can just. I mean, the Americans, because they're capitalists, they just think they can buy anything, and like, clearly the crucifix means more to her than what it's financially worth.
Yeah.
Great critique of capitalism there. Great spiritual critique of capitalism, but also spirituality not very compatible with the old Soviet vibe. So can't please them all.
I guess he was sitting it to the context of Cuba as well, and trying to make it. I mean, that was the struggle, right? Because he's like seeing Cuba as an outsider, and the voiceover acknowledges that. It says after the first section, it's like. You see us as our bars, our casinos, our dancing, blah blah blah. It kind of critiques the stereotypes of Cuba, even though that's kind of what it's all he has. But he made a pretty good job of like he shows the peasantry, he shows the students, he shows the urbanites. He kind of does a pretty good survey of people living in sharecrop farmers, all this stuff. because
I mean, as a propaganda film made by someone who's not Cuban and has not lived in Cuba for any length of time, I think he pretty much does best he could, really. Like, given that there would have been no one in his ear saying, like, trying to get him to make an authentic depiction of Cuban life, I think he does an okay job.
Yeah, he did an okay job. I mean, between him and Urashevsky, like you said, the shots. Can we talk about? Oh yeah. Can we have when
I say okay job, I mean in terms, because obviously the criticism was that stereotypes of Cuban life, and it's like, well, he was on the job he was on was to make something really like blunt and kind of like sort of propagandistic. So it's not like.
Yeah, he didn't do that. He came away with something very nuanced.
Yeah, exactly.
No, he was never going to be a mouthpiece, as it were. Like it was. Yeah, it comes down to the technologies of this film, and it's the weird infrared lighting, which kind of turns all of the palms into white rather than dark shades, which is quite. And the
sky
arresting.
Becomes very dark, even when it's shot with sun. Shot through with sun. I mean, that's amazing. It looks, and you don't really notice it immediately. You just feel like something's different. No. And my flatmate walked in and he was like, wow, the contrast is just quite extraordinary, but I don't quite understand why.
Yeah, and it's not as simple as just like a inversion of the contrast, is it? It's like, there's something else going on. This kind of...
How does that work? Does an infrared literally detect heat? Or does it just pick up certain colours and change them? I'm going to
betray my ignorance if I try and answer that question.
I think so. I'm very proud of myself for asking the question, therefore you're the one that has to go Google it now.
I have to go Google. I'm not going to do that though. Okay, I'm going to bathe in my ignorance, but it's just that we can at least acknowledge it aesthetically, which is what is all I have, and say, it produces a really interesting effect. We also have these cameras which are able to go underwater, so it's this quite amazing scene at the beginning where the camera descends from a rooftop party down to this kind of outside swimming pool, and it's kind of literally just floats down almost. I have no fucking idea whether it was on a rail or it was literally handled down, because he's got a very the handheld technique in this is amazing. This is such like a rousing celebration of handheld film, because it's the fact that it is kind of constantly shifting and moving in Urashevsky's hands. It just adds this extreme kind of dynamism to the film, which like you don't get when you have very static shots. You could have shot this film very statically, right? But the fact that it's on the floor and then he's obviously crouching on his knees, on his back, like the physical, like the contortions of the cameraman are insane. And it's like, so this camera goes down to the pool level, and then it goes into the water. We wade into the water, and he's obviously literally wading into the water and dunking the camera in with all these like beautiful lithe people swimming, and that doesn't serve like a revolutionary purpose. It's just insanely cool to look at, and I guess that's another reason why maybe the film wasn't received particularly well, because it just gets carried away with itself and excited by the possibilities of what it can do and what he can do with a camera.
This is the paradox of propaganda, though, because we often talk on this show about aboutness, right? And what is a film about, and how is it indirectly about that? How is it using something else to be about the thing it's about? And I feel like necessarily with any form of propaganda, if you're going to make effective propaganda, you can't just say the Tories are bad,
Orange Man bad.
Exactly, like Trump is good or bad. All these things are kind of blunt, and what you need is an emotional through line. You need an indirect thing. You need to lead the audience down a different road that they might find more appealing than something very dogmatic and banal, in order to illustrate something for them. So a good propagandist is always going to take that indirect path, but then while on that indirect path, they might end up just telling a really good story. And then, the propagandist people who are like, you were supposed to make everyone communist, might start, being like worried that it's sort of got sidetracked and not become about the thing it was meant to be about. But you can't make
it got seduced.
It's easy. The easiest one is with war films, I think, because Cranes Are Flying is a war film. I think war films, because they're about a direct conflict. Yep. It is easy, and obviously this film is also kind of a war film in that you see a lot of like revolutionary.
But you don't see the enemy, even during the.
But it is also an attempt to depict life in general, and So in those moments, it does fall short of the propagandist expectation, as it should, by being an artwork. But I think it's interesting, like Eisenstein. You know, we've both seen a bunch of Eisenstein and Pedrovkin and all these things. Man with the Movie Camera is actually also a good reference point, because that was a film.
Yeah, I was going to say Vertov's cinema.
He is a real innovator in cinematography.
It's
but
totally
Eisenstein also innovated. Like Eisenstein invented the montage edit through making a piece of propaganda. And in a way, I mean, I find Battleship Potemkin a bit of a pain in the arse, really, because it's propaganda. I find it quite boring,
it's much more two-tone.
Yeah, but you studied the scenes and it's extraordinary.
It's very inventive, but it's a good reference point because Battleship Potemkin has the it's much more high contrast in terms of evil and good. And it's this kind of Manichaean struggle of bad and good, or good and evil. But it still is, obviously this film is indebted to it, because Potemkin, because it was experimenting with montage and is experimenting with kind of radical form, was so much more than just a propaganda film, and this does the same. I think Kalatazov kind of rose to the task and said, I can't recreate Battleship Potemkin, but it's like, I'm going to try and create Battleship Potemkin for Cuba, and something that's authentic to the Cuban context. And I guess he kind of did that, but I mean, it has buried within it, these like really incredible melodramas. Like Pedro's story is, like, I think the most affecting. I think it's an amazing short. It's like it's shortest section. I think Pedro's a farmer working on his sugar plantation. The kind of farm boss tells him that he's sold his farm to United Fruit, and he's like, "What about my home?" And he's like, "You don't have a home here anymore," whatever. And it's this amazing kind of voiceover, Pedro's voiceover, because Pedro doesn't say much in this. And he has this mania frenzy where he kind of he just hacks into the sugar crop, and the camera begins to kind of follow the action of his blade up and down, and it's this insane. And he starts screaming at the sky. He's like, "I'm not tired." It's amazingly effective. He sends his kids off to the town to go and dance and listen to music, and then he burns his farm to the ground, and dies in the process. I think is the implication.
Total surrender, sacrifice.
Total sacrifice. Sacrifice is definitely a big part of this, right? Like, because he's like, Enrique sacrificed himself as he dies in these protests. There's
an amazing scene where he's like being shot by the police, and he's like carrying that rock, and there's smoke everywhere, and oh god. Yeah,
the actual smoke is amazing. Like,
I kept getting my phone out and just filming bits of it and just sending it on WhatsApp to people. Just being like, have you seen this movie? Like, if not, why not? I got Daniel to watch it. Daniel watched it like immediately.
What do you think?
Friend of the show, Daniel Neofiti, who reviewed House and The Couch in New York. Less said about that.
He's basically been there for all our great hits, all the greatest.
Shout out to Daniel. He'll probably be listening to this. Great friend of the pod and of me and you, he immediately watched it because it's great, and he loved it. I mean, it's really just it's just like, and all my flatmates as well, well one of them, Shay, she'd seen it, but Tom and Keith have both been a bit like me and you, like, oh god, I've been meaning to see that for ages, but haven't. I don't know what that is. Maybe partly because it's propaganda, and partly because it's over 2 hours long. I think it's one of those movies that gets pushed down the list a bit,
because there's not a compelling, there's not like it's definitely essential. There's not a compelling central reason why you should watch it, as it were, because if you're looking at the kind of the epics of Russian cinema, maybe, or whatever, you're probably going to go to like Doshenko or Pedrovkin or Eisenstein or Vertov or Tarkovsky or Paryanov, whatever first. Kalatazov kind of exists there, but is kind of a bit sidelined, I guess. And it took the restoration of this film by Scorsese, Coppola later, to kind of bring it out of the doldrums.
Do you know any of his other work? Because this morning I started watching Letter Never Sent, which is quite. I only watched a bit of it, but it was not as it was well done, but I wasn't hugely gripped by it, because I guess it had that kind of energy that a lot of Russian films of that era have, which is like, it's about a bunch of people sort of stranded on a mission, and it's very long. It's sort of not long, but like there's a sense of
they're quite sentimental films.
I think
I've seen Cranes Are Flying. I've seen some of Red Tent, but only because it's got
that's the one with Sean Connery.
Sean Connery in it.
Rest in peace. You're supposed to say rest in peace. People, there was a huge thing. Everyone's saying different things about Sean Connery, good, bad, all that.
I know a really good story about Sean Connery, a personal anecdote, but I'm not going to share it here. That's for the premium subscribers.
You can't do that.
It's a really, really good story. I need to check the details with the person who told it to me. It's a first-hand anecdote about Sean Connery.
Amazing. It's not the one where he says you should hit women.
It's not that one, no. But that's the other famous Sean Connery story, you know. So yeah, I will tell you that personally. Maybe on a later episode of MoobTube, I'll recount the full story because it is worth it. There's a little nugget
tease.
to like come back, cock tease. But yeah, this film, it's hypnotic, lyrical. I'm going to sound like the Beastie Boys there.
A lyrical miracle.
Lyrical miracle. It's incredibly inventive. The cinematography is exceptionally just fun to watch. Like, you know, it's a lot of like, how the fuck did they do that? Because you can't do that with as much with modern cinema, but with a more manual analog type of cinema, there's always
it's like drone vibe, Steadicam drone vibes before either of those things were invented. And the guy, they basically like had the guy in a harness, and he'd like step out the window, and then they'd immediately hook him onto a harness, and he'd sort of fly across over the road. That's in the middle,
down the middle of the street. That's how they did it. Oh, insane! Because he passes over the Cuban flag on the balcony and floats, down. It's insane.
Fucking
it's so good,
amazing.
There is the camera passing through rooms. It's kind of this roving eye.
I'd love to watch it again. Actually,
I really want to watch it again. I don't know much more to say about it, you know, because it's one of those films that is not particularly. There's not much dialogue. It's very sensual. It's something you kind of bathe in. But it does have these kind of core stories about sacrifice and about the complexity and the ambiguity of human motivations. Like, it is, in a way, quite Marxist in a way. It is material conditions that push people to revolt in this. It's not the higher concept of revolution. People have to come to that realization through loss and trauma. So in a way, the film is actually quite politically correct, as it were, to orthodox Marxist-Leninist thought, I think, you know. But yeah, it's incredibly powerful. I didn't really relate as strongly to the final chapter. I think. I mean, it's quite sad because the guy obviously loses his son in this bombing and joins the revolution. But I think that was much more kind of stirring, rousing end to the film. But it's not as nuanced as Pedro's story or Enrique's story or Betty's story.
Absolutely agree with that one. Yeah, I was a little bit let down by the fourth one because it was just a bit kind of macho death guns vibe. But I liked that final anecdote about the rifles. But yeah, basically it was not as strong.
It was almost like that. He was like, "Oh, I should probably put like a proper propaganda bit on at the end so I don't get completely slain."
It's such a shame that, because he was slain anyway. You know, you may as well go full Tarkovsky and just make something incredibly spiritually meaningful if you're just going to get cancelled by the Soviets and then die a few years later anyway.
He was cancelled, wasn't he?
Seasons in Constellation.
That's a little callback to Seasons in Concy.
Terrible film.
I think terrible film. And we've really run the gamut on just thinking kind of about the kinds of films we've covered on this podcast. Like, I feel like we've truly covered every genre now, apart from like sport biopic. Like,
we haven't done any opera films.
No, we have in a way, because Schroeder's Melina is kind of an opera. So he's an operatic director. Can we get away with that?
Very true. Very good. All right.
There we go.
Well, I think we've hit time on that.
Truly wonderful, wasn't it?
Really great to talk about a film we both loved. And next week, what do we think for next week? We haven't talked about it really.
Something uplifting. I feel this was a good balm for the soul and the eyes, and I think now we need something. We've had a few duds. I don't know.
Yeah, I really want to do a Philip Garrel week. I don't know if next week is that week, but I'm becoming very excited by Philip Garrel. excited and also confused, and I'd like to share that excitement and confusion with someone else, possibly a whole podcast audience.
All 17 of our listeners. 17
is it even that?
Is it even that? I don't know.
No, we do have quite a lot of regular listeners now. We do have. It's quite.
Yeah, we do.
I don't really know who all of them are, which is a good sign.
But if you are a regular listener, pop up in the chat, DM us.
Please get in touch. We're very approachable.
Yeah.
We're not judgmental people at all, and if we are, it's only because of our own deep insecurity, which we're working on in various forms of therapy.
Indeed. I mean, all the target of our ridicule deserves it. So you've also got to bear that in mind. Kalatazov, what a king. What a shame. Absolutely. He didn't continue making films. But he died of relatively natural causes. It wasn't like he was quite an old man. He was 69 when he died, so it wasn't like he kind of stopped.
Legend.
He died at 4:20 in 69. It's not like he kind of stopped making films because he couldn't. Like, he did make a film subsequent to this, which apparently is perfectly okay. Like I said, I've only seen bits of it. So
was it in the West though? It had Sean Connery in it.
No, it was a Italian co-production, which was relatively normal, as we know, with like Nostalgia. I
thought Nostalgia was just like totally Italian because Tarkovsky had left, hadn't he?
Wasn't there Ruski money behind it? I don't know, but it was a not unusual thing to have kind of co-productions.
MoveTube, where you go for the facts.
Where you go for the alternative facts. Remember that? Do you remember alternative facts?
Those are the days. Gonna miss that guy.
Yeah.
Who will MoveTube invade next?
Who will MoveTube invade next? I don't know.
Tune in next week to find out which country we will be reviewing a film from. Probably France, because that
probably
comes
France
up quite often.
I feel like we should descend and go south. I think we've kind of maligned large parts of the globe. I'm not saying this to be woke, but I feel like we're missing a trick.
No, I would never accuse you of being woke.
Never. I think we need to step foot outside of Europe.
Yeah. No, I agree.
I'm scared, but I think we should do it.
Yeah, good exposure. To deal with your racism. On that note, thank you for listening, listeners. We will be back again next week.
Same time next week.
Bye.
Bye.